Happy Sabbath. Thank you for joining us. This is part 3 of about the Nephilim. And this part is who are the giants and where did they go? And I want you to just review, okay? So this will be very fast. You can watch part 1 and part 2 already on our YouTube channel, Palm Harbor SDA. You can find it on YouTube, and you'll be able to go over this. But I just want to start off with the premise. The whole reason why I started this whole series is that there's been a lot of interest in aliens, and people believe that the Nephilim is a code for aliens that live among us, and that this code starts with the book of Genesis, and it's sort of represented in the book of Enoch. And so we need to understand that they're aliens or half-hybrid human angels running around and things like that. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to take a sober analysis from the Bible itself. And so in part 1, I examine who are the sons of God. And I go through the details. And I show in the pseudepigrapha that over and over again it speaks with one voice that these are fallen angels. However, when you examine the Bible, there is one passage that mentions that angels are sons of God. But through the whole balance of Scripture, what we find over and over again, sons of God refers to those who have a covenant-keeping relationship with God. And indeed, when we examine the Hebrew and we look at the idea of sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, and we look at it very carefully, what we find is that these sons of God marry the daughters of women because they think they're beautiful. And I point out how angels do not get married. God makes it very clear in that in the book of Genesis, there's not even angels talked about in those first 6 chapters. What you find talked about is 2 races of human beings. One that follow after Cain and live in sin, and another, like Seth, who call upon the name of the Lord, which is what we find. And then, of course, I go through the evidence in the New Testament. In the New Testament, I show how Jesus talks about in the days of Noah. He makes it very clear that the great issues of their day was the fact that they were marrying and giving in marriage. They weren't listening. They were doing whatever they wanted. You find that throughout there. You find, again, that angels cannot marry. You find that sons of God is often referred to God's people, as we find in Exodus chapter 4 and Deuteronomy 14. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, you find the same thing. You even find Hosea 1 that sons of God is looking prophetically in the future where God's people will be brought back into the covenant. That means the Gentiles will be brought back in. You can go on and on. Even Isaiah 56, which is the great call to the Gentiles, talks about those who keep his Sabbaths and do what pleases him will have a greater name than the sons of Israel. So this idea of sons of God is all throughout there. We even have Jesus arguing with the Pharisees and Sadducees about what sons of God means. And he says that even though they have the correct genetic code and they can trace their lineage back to Abraham, that they are not actually children of Abraham because they disobey God, because they're not living as Abraham lived, but they are willing to murder, and Abraham would not murder Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, Jesus appeared before him as God himself, and Abraham actually bowed down and worshiped him. And then, of course, he says that they're really children of their father, the devil. So again, this idea of sons of God is very important. We find that Jesus' mission is to make fallen human beings into sons of God. And we see that Paul talks about those who are sons of God who live by the Holy Spirit. We find at the very end the consummation of all things is God is going to reunite his people, and he will be our Father, and we will be his sons and daughters. So that is part 1. Part 2, which I covered, is I examine what is the word Nephilim, and I point out how really it refers to fallen ones, and how when we go through Genesis that nothing, not even half-hybrid human being angels, could survive the flood if they were not in the ark. So if there were giants before the flood, why do we have giants after the flood? And I point out that there are giants all over the Bible that in places that you wouldn't think. We always think of Goliath, but we have them here in these words in green. The Rephaim, the Zumim, the Emim, the Horites, all of these were ancient tribes that lived in the land of Canaan who were giants and were warlike. And of course, I show the Jewish historian Josephus, and how he mentions that these were giants. So as we go back, the whole point is that these kings who conquer Palestine from Babylon, they encounter the giants, and they go from one side of the region of the Euphrates to the other. And again, the word Rephaites comes from the word Rephaim, which just comes from the word Rapha, and talks about giants. And we find giants everywhere, all over the Old Testament. And most importantly, what you find in Numbers is that the people were afraid because they knew they would have to conquer the giants who were in the land. Again, the idea is that if giants were only those who were half hybrid human creatures, right? Why is it that they exist after the flood? And why is it that God's people have to fight them? The idea is that giants, believe it or not, are part of our actually heritage. That's our genetic code. It's not some space aliens. It's not some angels. It's our genetic code. And this is the point, is that through God's mercy and grace, we have to confront giants. Whether back then they had to confront the physical ones, we have to confront the spiritual ones to this day. And what we find in Numbers and what we find throughout the testimony of Scripture is that through God's grace, we are able, no matter how menacing, no matter how tough, we are able to conquer them. So I point out all the giants, and I even point out Og of Bashan, and this article from the Armstrong Institute of Archaeology, which is great, points out that there's actual evidence for this giant who had a bedstand that was very large, that was maybe about 15 feet long, which means that Og might have been 13 feet tall, and it was made out of iron because he was so heavy. And I point out that there's actually some evidence. There's inscriptions that Og was deified, that he was deified, and they would offer up prayers to him. They would talk about him. So this is the idea that he probably truly existed, that there's literal evidence for giants. And I also show the very areas that God's people had to conquer were populated with giants. God could have sent his people to an area where no one was, but he sent them to the very area. It says, see the area where the giants are? That's where I'm sending you. And a lot of times in our own walk with Jesus, we go, Lord, why do I have to face these things? And the Lord says, but I told you to. Go, face these things. Why? Because God doesn't remove all the difficulties in our life. He builds us up so that we can overcome them. And that's exactly what he did with his people. I talked about Caleb and how at 85 years old, he led his army to overthrow the giants, and they were able to conquer them. And I even show the valley of Rephaim, which means Valley of the Giants, is exactly where they had to go. So after all of that, now we're going to look at actual evidence for giants throughout history, all right? And the reason why we're going to do this is because of this. How many of you have seen this? This is allegedly how we all got here. We start with the gibbon, we go to the orangutan, the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and boom, we have man. Now that's the skeleton, and now the reason why I love this skeleton is that when you look at it long enough, you're like, that doesn't look like human beings at all. What are we doing here? What are we doing here? But they put it in this order to make you think that this is what happened. And then artists do this and they go, see what's happening here? We evolved. We're better. We're taller. We're smarter. Look at what's happened to us. Now, I think if they did this, it's a little bit more accurate. This is a little bit more accurate than what they had before. That's actually a little bit more accurate, except for the monkey part. This is what we've become. But the point of the matter is that they want us to believe in this onward, upward progress, that we're somehow getting better. But my argument is that we were made in the image of God, and we have lost things over the years. And I want to demonstrate that through history and through Scripture. But before we do that, what are we going to do? Pray. We're going to pray. So let us bow our heads. Gracious and Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for your Holy Scriptures. In them is everlasting life because they testify of you, Lord. And they tell us about a history, about our lives, about human nature, about the untold things that have happened throughout time that people want to forget. And yet you remind us, Lord, that we were made in your image. And you are coming to redeem us and bring us back to your image. And Lord, there's nothing greater than this. This is the work of the gospel. But it is important to see what we've lost because of sin. And I pray that we will open up our hearts and our minds to understand what we have lost due to sin. So this is an article, again, from the Armstrong Institute of Archaeology. And again, I have a picture of a giant from the Chico, California press. And it shows that this guy is a real man. This is a picture taken in 1948, and he was 8 feet 8 inches. And so we have in memory, recent memory, the idea that there are people who were actually tall and strong. And again, what you'll find now in the scientific press, allegedly scientific press, is they'll be like, oh, they all have acromegalia. Does anyone know what acromegalia is? No. Acromegalia is when you get a tumor on your pituitary gland and it grows and it keeps pumping growth hormone in your body, so you get unusually large, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you just have a massive forehead and your nose gets big and your jaw gets big, but you don't actually grow very much taller because your growth plates are already closed. But the point of the matter is that not everyone who has acromegalia is a giant, but all giants are indeed giants. Now, there are people who live today who are above 7 feet tall, but they are very sickly. They can't hardly do anything. Their bones break. But there were people who got to 8 feet 8 inches who were actually tall and strong and didn't have any problems. And what does this tell us about us today? But we're going to look at some evidence from of one of the most famous giants, of the most famous giant, which is Goliath. But before we do that, we're going to look at Egyptian records. So this is the Papyrus Anastasi 1, and this is actually housed in the British Museum. And what's interesting about this is that the Egyptians, talking around the 13th century, so this is maybe about the 1200s. This is the time period of the conquest and the judges, the time period of the judges and conquest of Canaan. So we know that there were giants in the land according to the Bible, but this is Egyptian records. And according to these Egyptian records, this little scroll here it's basically teaching scribes the lay of the land. They're teaching them about geography. They're teaching them how to write. And this is what they teach them. You can read the middle paragraph. The text mentions the Levantine tribe. The Levantine is this area where it includes Syria and Palestine and parts of the Euphrates. That's the Levantine area. The text mentions the Levantine tribe called the Shasu and its warriors. The valley region is infested with Shasu. Some of them are 4 cubits or 5 cubits from head to foot, fierce of face. Their heart is not mild, and they hearken not to coaxing. Now, again, this idea is that, we say 4 or 5 cubits, but that's between 7 and 8 feet tall, almost 9 feet tall. And these are the Egyptians. This isn't the Bible. These are the Egyptians saying, we know there's a race of people who live over there where God's people are settling, who are giants. We know this. And they write about it without any hyperbole, without any mythology. They know that they exist. Here's an interesting thing. So look here carefully. These are Shasu warriors in the middle, and they're being beaten by the Egyptians. Now, normally in Egyptian artistic rendering or iconography, normally that the Egyptians are large. So if you look here, this is a relief from Pharaoh, and look how big he is. Pharaoh's bigger than everyone. He's riding down everyone. His chariot's bigger. His arrows are bigger. He's bigger than everyone. That's how they always draw themselves. But on this instant, talking about the Shasu warriors, they draw themselves standing almost as tall as the Shasu are kneeling. If you look carefully, the Shasu are on their knees. They are on their knees before these guys. And the reason why they're doing this is that they're celebrating their victory over the Shasu. So they're showing them tall because they really are, and they're saying, yeah, these guys are tall. These are the guys that we defeated. And so you look at that and you go, wait, so they're apparently in the land, which we find the region where Goliath lives and all that, there were giants, and even the Egyptians acknowledge it? Yes, the Egyptians acknowledged it. They acknowledged that there were giants in the land, so we have some extra biblical evidence. But the most famous example, of course, is Goliath. And we have it here. So I have the New King James and the King James because the New King James and the NIV, because the NIV gives us some renderings about how tall Goliath is. But I'm going to read it in the NKJV. So this is 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we'll start here. Let's see, verse 4, and so it says, "And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor in his legs, and bronze javelin between his shoulders. And now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and an iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him." Now, the NIV sort of disambiguates this, giving you the actual measurements. So if you look here at the footnotes, it says that he was about 9 feet 9 inches or 3 meters, which is a massive man, and that he was wearing that according to his coat of armor, it was 125 pounds. So do you know what modern military guys carry today? You know what they carry? They roughly carry about 25 to 30 pounds. That's what they wear, their rucksack, their ammunition, their supplies. That's what our modern, and we're talking guys who are in really good shape. Maybe 40 pounds if you give them a little bit more ammunition, a heavier gun. But that's what our modern soldiers who are in tip-top shape wear. Not starting out, wearing armor that weighs 125 pounds. You'd have to be a very strong and powerful man to be able to fight with all your speed and might wearing armor that weighs 125 pounds. In other words, armor that weighed 125 pounds to him is like us wearing a winter jacket. That's how it was. That's the scale. And then it says that he has a spear about 15 pounds. So again, spears today, they're usually made for their lightness. The wood is actually light, the spearhead is light, and they're not more than 3 to 4 pounds. We're 5 times the size and weight of what normal men could carry. This indeed was a giant. And of course, we know what people say. Oh, well, we know we evolved. We know that this picture, this picture is true. We just know that we're better. There's no way. That's hyperbole. David and all them were about 4'5", and, Goliath might have been maybe 6 foot. That didn't happen. There's no way that it happened. No way. Because why? Because this narrative can't be true. It is easier to believe in aliens. It is easier to believe in angels mating with human beings, but it cannot be that this narrative is not true, because the facts of the Bible do not fit that narrative. And so Christians have allowed it to be talked away. Here's an interesting thing. And let's see, this is 1999, just before Y2K and all the things that we were told are going to stop the world. This is in 1999, December 21st, and they actually found Gath. They actually exhumed Gath, and they started finding all kinds of relics. In other words, the very city where Goliath lived was a real city. And they found artifacts there, all kinds of things coming from Gath. Years later, in a site adjacent to Gath, they found these giant spearheads in Gath. Now, what they say today is that, well, those are just for ceremony. They weren't actually used. Well, they tested them, and it turns out those spear points were actually used. And these spear points, as large as they are, were not even as big as what Goliath had. So this is what it says. It says the biggest spear, you can read it in the middle paragraph, the biggest spear found in the Monash Horde. So this is the Monash Horde. You can look it up. This was found just outside the region of Gath, where Goliath was found. This is from the Philistines. The spear found in the Monash Horde weighed 2.05 kilograms. Spearhead, not the whole spear, the spearhead. Yes, so you see this spear point right there, like D. So D, like A, B, and D are massive ones. If you look, right next to D, there's a very small one. That's a normal one. That's normal. See, like the very small, that's normal. So they found these, which gives you the idea that the guys who lived in Gath were hurling spears and fighting with spears that were massive. But even these spears, it talks about, they said that, this is what it says. It says 1 iron shekel is the equivalent of 12.9 grams, which makes the largest Monash spearhead approximately 160 shekels. So the largest of they found, which is like D, that's huge, right? And it's roughly almost 5 pounds, which is still heavy as a spear point, very heavy. They said that as large as it is not even close to Goliath's. The largest that they found is 160 iron shekels. Goliath's spearhead was 600 shekels, or 16 pounds and 11 ounces. That tells you that even here, where they're hurling these giant spear points, they're still not as big or as powerful as Goliath. And then it says this, the biblical reference of a weaver's beam is most likely in respect to the unusual thickness and strength of the shaft rather than the length. The weaver's beam reference contrasts the normal, smaller, thinner spear that would have been handled by an average man. And then it talks about the 4 verses in there. But it's interesting that the idea is that even his spear beam was thicker and his head was heavier. So we've found evidence. 1, that Goliath's town exists. 2, that there's giant iron or giant bronze spear points that could have been wielded by men of unusual size, and yet Goliath's was still bigger. So we have evidence of giants existing. And then we have more evidence of the Bible which talks about giants and how they were slain by David's mighty men. And this is one of them. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 21. And he talks about a time where David is older and he rides out to battle. So we'll start in verse 16. It says, and Ishibi-Benob was one of those sons of the giant, a weight of whose bronze spear was 300 shekels. So that's not quite as big as Goliath's, but still very big. So that's maybe 10 pounds. who was bearing a new sword, and he thought to kill David, but Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swore to him, saying, You shall go out no more with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel. So even though David had killed Goliath, there were still giants in the land. And then it goes on and it talks about other giants which were killed. And now it happened afterward, there were again a battle with the Philistines at Gob. And Sibbecai, the Hushite, killed Saph, who was one of the sons of the giant. And there was a war at Gob with the Philistines, where Elnathan, the son of Orgrim, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath of the Gittite, whose shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. So again, notice they're talking about all these giants all over the place. Like they're just like the Shasu, who existed in the time of the Egyptians during the time of the Judges. And remember, David is just after the time of the Judges. They're talking about killing these giants. All of this makes sense. He says, Yet there was war at Gath, and there was a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and whose also was born to the giant. So when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. So this basically talks about all the giants who were killed. And it's interesting, when David picks up 5 stones, many people think, well, 5 is a good number, like 5 fingers. But no, the idea is that there were actually 5 giants, and David was willing to kill them all, a stone each.
You said 5 fingers?
No, I said we have 5 fingers. But David picked up 5 stones not because he has 5 fingers, but rather because there were 4 other giants after Goliath that needed some killing. That's why he did it. The man with 6 fingers and 6 toes is a condition we call polydactyly, and that does exist to this very day. So it is entirely possible that there was a man who was a giant who had 6 fingers and 6 toes, 24 in total. So there is entirely the case. So I just want to point that out, that again, the Bible speaks as giants. As they fought them, they killed them, they overcame them. Here's another interesting one. This is 2 Samuel chapter 23, and I'll read it here in the NIV. I have both the NKJV and NIV next to one another. It says, Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, a valiant fighter from Kabzeel, performed great exploits. He struck down Moab's 2 mightiest warriors. He also went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion, and he struck down a huge Egyptian. Although the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched a spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. Such exploits of Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, who was as famous as the 3 mighty warriors, he was held in greater honor than any of the 30, but he was not included among the 3. This is Benaiah, who's one of the mighty men. And again, talking about him killing a giant. If they weren't giants, if they didn't have, and again, they're not always giving you the measure of how tall they are, but they talk about the thickness of his spear shaft, talking about his sight and it says he was huge. He was very tall, very powerful. And First Chronicles gives us a little bit more detail about about the giants that are killed, gives us a little bit more detail about it, and talks about how big they were. But also we have in First Chronicles 11, it talks about how tall the Egyptian was. And so it says, you see here in verse 23, this is about Benaiah again. He's the mighty man of David, and he kills a giant. It says he killed an Egyptian man of great height, 5 cubits tall, which means he was nearly 9 feet tall. He was almost as tall as Goliath. The Egyptian hand, there was a spear like a weaver's beam, and he went down to him with a staff. The idea is that this Benaiah was so bold that he goes and fights a giant who has a spear the size of a weaver beam, who's nearly 9 feet tall, and he fights him with nothing more than a club, and he ends up winning. So this is the idea. This would not be a mighty man if this weren't true. In other words, the Bible is being written from the perspective that this is an incredible deed. To slay a giant this big is incredible. So it's all about, as a matter of fact, reporting. And so before we go into history, I want to give a word of caution, because I've done a deep dive into this, and there are incredible stories of men 25 or 45 feet tall. Those are usually tied into myth. They are not true. Most of them are not true. So I wanted to find stories that were actually told as a matter of fact, that come from sources that are not trying to mythologize the idea of giants. All right? So I tried to pick the very best one, because there's a lot riding on this. If the idea was that man was born large and tall and powerful, and we've been degenerating, then the idea of the onward, upward progress of evolution just isn't true. That's what's at stake. So we have to choose the stories that are the most accurate, because there's many of them. So this is Pliny the Elder, and Pliny the Elder lives from AD 23 to AD 79, nearly a contemporary with Jesus. All right. So this is a man who's a contemporary with Jesus. He's considered a naturalist and a historian. So he basically writes as a matter-of-fact way about what exists in the world as far as he knows it. And he travels all over the ancient world, and he pulls up information, and he talks to people, and he gathers all this data, and he's writing about nature, and he's writing about the affairs of mankind on the earth. He's doing this as a sober reflection of what the known knowledge is at that time in Rome, all right? So this is just what's known. These are facts. These are not myths. He's just going to talk about what they know. And he's also a Stoic, so I want you to hear what he has to say. So this is from his book, and this is what he says. He says, "It is a well-known fact. At the age of 3 years, the body of each person is half the height that he will ever attain." I don't know if that's true. It might be. Taking it all in all, it is observed that the human race, the stature is almost daily becoming less and less, and sons are rarely taller than their parents, and the fertility of the seed is being dried up by the heat of that conflagration to which the world is fast approaching. Now, wait a second. This almost sounds straight up biblical right here. I mean, what is he talking about? Well, one, he's looking at the race of Romans that exists at his time. And what he's saying is, he's like, I notice, and all the old timers notice, that we are becoming weaker, more defective, shorter, and we're dying in a rapid rate. That's what he's saying at his time. Now, let me be very clear. In case you were wondering, there was no Monsanto back then. That means there was no glyphosate, and there were no GM crops. I know it's hard to imagine because we never thought we'd live without them. There was no shot schedule with 72 shots. People, believe it or not, they lived without that. Isn't that crazy? So there's a lot of things that they didn't have that we have today, all right? And so even back then, he was saying, we're falling apart. We're not even as great as the generations that were before us. And then he goes on, and notice what he says here. He mentions that fertility is drying up. Do you realize that the fertility rates of men, so just this is a brief aside, and Sean could tell you about this, he's actually studied it, that the amount of testosterone that men produce today is less, and at the same age is less than half of what their grandfather produced. Less than half than what their grandfather produced. Sperm counts for men have basically went like this and then off a cliff. And we're not exactly sure why. It could be everything in our environment, plastics, who knows? We don't know. Or it could be, besides plastics and all the other thus saith the science stuff that we do, it could be that mankind is simply just falling apart, which is exactly it. And notice this. Pliny, who's a Roman writing at the time of Jesus, is observing this. He's just observing this. He's like, this is what we see. And then he says this. He says, being dried up by the heat of that conflagration to which the world is fast approaching. Now, he's not a Bible believer, but he believes that the world is going to be destroyed by fire because of the wickedness of man. He's a Stoic. And so he sees people who are given over to their feelings and emotions and indulging in drinking revelries, orgies, you name it. He sees it all and he's like, society can't last for very much longer. There's just no way. And he was right in a sense. Rome did collapse, and it did collapse from within. So he was right in that sense. But that's how he felt. And again, this is at the time of Jesus. But listen to what he says about what they know about large men even in their day. He says this, it is generally believed from what is stated in ancient records. All right, so these are sober records, that the body of Orestes, he's mentioned in Greek history, which was disinterred by the command of an oracle, was 7 cubits in height. So 7 cubits height makes him about 13 feet tall. So this is what they know. They've seen the bones. They said that Orestes was about 13 feet tall. And he says that it is now nearly 1,000 years ago that the divine poet Homer. So remember Homer? Many of you remembered back in the day where you had to read the Iliad, the Odyssey, and you were told about Homer. And notice what he says about Homer, because you didn't read this. This was excluded from your version of the Iliad and the Odyssey. This was excluded from there. This is what he says. It is now nearly 1,000 years ago that the divine poet Homer was unceasingly complaining that men were less stature in his day than they had formerly been. Now, wait a second. Pliny is saying that mankind is less stature in his day. That's at the time, that's 2,000 years ago. And 1,000 years back, the great poet that Greece loves and worships was saying mankind is falling apart in his day. And they could see it. And somehow, today, we're looking at that model, the evolutionary model, and we're like, look at all the progress we're making. It's absurd. We just ignore all this. So now it goes on, and notice what he says here. Our annals, that means the historical, sober record. Notice what he says. Our annals do not inform us what was the height of Navius Pollio, but we learn from them that he was nearly lost his life from the rush of people to see him. In other words, this man was so tall that everyone wanted to see him, and they couldn't believe he was so big. They don't know how tall he was, but he was of unusual height. He says that he was looked upon as a prodigy. In other words, that he was so rare, like a miracle almost, that no one could believe it. He says the tallest man that has been seen in our times, all right? So in their times, in his day, in the day of Jesus, there's a man that existed, all right? This is what he says. The tallest man that had been seen in our times was one Galabras by name, who was brought from Arabia by the Emperor Claudius. His height was 9 feet and as many inches, so nearly 10 feet tall. In the reign of Augustus, there were two persons, Posio and Secundula, by name, who were half a foot taller than him. So in other words, if he's nearly 10 feet, these guys were nearly 11 feet. Nearly 11 feet tall, and their bodies have been preserved as objects of curiosity in the Museum of the Salustian family. So in his day, he's like, we know of people who are 11 feet tall. There's a guy who just came here, who came in the reign of Emperor Claudius, who was an Arabian, who was 10 feet tall. We have the Greeks complaining that men are getting shorter and weaker. We have all of this information here. So notice that even this sober Roman historian and naturalist is talking about these things not as myth, but as simple fact. And this harmonizes with the biblical record. Now, over here, this is obviously AI. But that Roman coin is not. And that Roman coin is from an emperor who came after Alexander Severus, and this is Maximinus Thrax, all right? And what's interesting about him is that not only had a very short reign, but he too was a giant. So this is from the new encyclopedia Schaff-Herzog, Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge. And so they're just merely saying what the ancient record said, all right? This is all they're doing. They're just telling you what the ancient record said. And it talks about him, let's see, it talks about his height here. I'll just read it from there. It says right here, so it says right after June 17th, 238, it says the first barbarian to occupy the throne of the Caesars. He was in early life a cowherd and later a cavalryman. 8 feet in height and powerful and brave in proportion, he gained favor with Alexander Severus, who made him a senator and the head of a legion, as well as a trainer of recruits and compatriots. So the reason why they show this here is that he was 8 feet 8 inches, and they would have other Roman soldiers wrestle with him because they like, hey, if you can wrestle with this guy, you can take out anyone. And he was purported to be so fast that when a guy was on his horse, running with his horse, this guy could keep up at a full sprint because he was so tall, because his strides were so large. And another record, this is from our Bartolome Platina, who also looked at it. He says, according to this, and this is an actual Roman emperor, all right? So this isn't like made up. This isn't made up. He really did exist. That is his coin. That's not AI. This is AI. I know it's hard to distinguish these days. But that is not AI. And so the point is that he really did exist. He really was of great height. And now the modern record's like, well, you know, everyone back then was 4'9". That's why he appeared so big. No. They were right. This man was massive. And the point is that he was so big, allegedly, that he could drink almost a gallon of wine in one sitting and not get drunk. And he would wear his wife's necklace as a bracelet on his wrist. That's how big he was. A massive human being. And again, these are just sober records of history. And you can look them up, and again, they'll talk it away. They're like, oh, well, you know, we evolved. There's no way everyone was that big. That's all they can say, because the records are too numerous. Anyone ever been to Tuscaloosa, Alabama? Anyone know about Tuscaloosa, Alabama? Right. Has anyone ever heard of Moundville, Alabama? So I didn't think so. So there's an interesting thing you can do. There is a series of mounds from Ohio that work its way down through the Mississippi, all the way down into Alabama. And there are mounds where they have discovered giant skeletons all over it. And as a matter of fact, many of them are parks to this day. But if you go there, you will never hear anything about the giant skeletons. You will not hear one word. And yet you will find in the records that they were found. But Tuscaloosa is very interesting. The city that bears his name is named after a real man who was seen by De Soto. So we talk about Hernando de Soto. He came here. He came here in Florida, and he worked his way all the way towards the Mississippi, making his way through Alabama. And there are a series of priests and people who were with him who wrote diaries and journals, and they sent them back to Spain. And all these records, not just the priests, but also the people who survived, wrote the same things. Every time we encountered some of these Native Americans who were living here, they were of massive size. These are eyewitnesses. This is like in the 1500s, all right? And so they talk about a Chief Tuscaloosa that they find there, which is the town is named after him because he's so big. And this is taken from their journals. So this is one of the things that they talk about him. And this is how they describe him, right? Tuscaloosa was a man of commanding appearance, and though more than 7 feet in height, was so symmetrically proportioned that he might have been chosen as a model of manly beauty. He was taller than any of his people by more than a foot. But though his shoulders were broad and massive, his waist was slender. While his hands and his feet were small and well molded, his eyes and hair were black as coal. Again, this is a description. This isn't people making this up. They saw this man breathing before them. And it says his hair was black as coal, his face was expressive and intelligent, but his mouth was wide. His teeth were ivory white and fang-like, giving him the appearance of a cannibal. Now, you have to understand, they experienced cannibals in those days. There was cannibalism, like a lot of times, again, I'm not here to be mean to anyone who has Native American heritage. I'm not being mean. But let me be very clear. There are plenty of stories of indigenous tribes who eat other people. And it's all over the place. If there was like maybe one or two, we could be like, oh, we'll dismiss that. But they're all over the place. They're doing it all the time. It's incredible how much is there. And you could read even missionary stories where they go to the Pacific Islands and they're eating people. And so you can read that. That is actually a real thing. So they had experienced cannibals all over the United States when they were coming here. And so it says, and then notice what they say here. There was considerable difficulty was experienced in finding him a steed or a horse sufficiently strong to bear his mighty frame. In other words, they couldn't even put him on a regular horse because he was so big and tall. But finally, he was placed upon a pack horse. A pack horse is a large horse that is just designed for towing heavy wagons. That's what a pack horse is. And it was just strong enough to put Chief Tuscaloosa on, the sturdiest beast in the troop, and while his feet nearly touched the ground. So how many of you ever ridden a regular horse and you had trouble with your feet nearly touching the ground? Anyone? I didn't think so. I just didn't think so. But that is exactly what they noticed here. It is also said that when they came to see Chief Tuscaloosa, that he was sitting with his legs folded and they were as tall as he was sitting, which gives you an idea he certainly was every bit of 7 feet plus inches in height. So this is what they experienced. This is from their observation. Here's another guy who we think is a truth teller, Abraham Lincoln. And I want you to see what he says. So he goes and visits the Niagara Falls in 1848. And he decides to write his reflection, almost like poetry, about the Niagara Falls. So he goes up there and he's so overawed with the Niagara Falls. Listen to what he says here. So listen to what he says. But there's still more. He's talking about looking at the Niagara Falls, its beauty and everything. But there's still more. It calls up the indefinite past, when Columbus first sought this continent, when Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led Israel through the sea, nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his Maker. Then, as now, Niagara was roaring here. The eyes of that species of extinct giants, whose bones now fill the America, have gazed on Niagara as... Wait, what? Did he just say what I think he just said? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Listen to what he says. I'll read it again. The eyes of that species of extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do now. That's interesting. Why would he say that? Why would he say that there is an extinct race of giants that existed in the Americas? Well, glad you asked. I'm sure you wanted to know. This is an article. This is one of the more sober ones that I found, because there's many of them. This is in 1891, and there were others in the 1840s and 1830s where people would be farming and they would dig up these mounds and they would find giant human skeletons. And so this is from the Daily News from Pensacola, Florida, in September 13th, 1891. And what do they talk about? They said that they found a femur about 19 inches long while they were digging up a mound. All right, they found over 300 skeletons in there, and they found some extremely large. A femur that is 19 inches long means that you were over 10 feet tall. That's what that means. And they would find these things. And so this is what Abraham Lincoln is talking about. They were constantly digging up human remains, finding them to be of giant proportion. And they weren't like, well, wait, we can't talk about that because evolution is true. No, they didn't think about it. They said, well, yeah, obviously there were giants back then. Duh, of course. They didn't think about that. And so even he talks about it as if it's fact. That's what he says. He believes it's fact. That just as these giants who lived in the Americas looked on Niagara, just as we do today. That's how he sees it. And again, it's from expeditions like this. Here's a picture of an actual giant who's over 8 feet tall, and his name is Mr. Wilkins, and he was an American, and this is in 1896. So we know that there were people who lived who were over 8 feet tall who did not suffer from acromegalia. We know this, and we even have a woodcut or a printed image of it. But also, we have other evidence of giants being found. This is from the Tampa Bay Times in 1906, and it's very short. I'll read you this. It talks about the Jamestown Exposition. So I want you to understand this, that there was an expedition where they were showing everything they found in the Illinois River. So they dug up a mound and they found all this pottery, spear points, axe heads, and they found giant skeletons. And so what they did is they created an exhibit that people could come visit back in the day. In 1906, people could go see these giant skeleton bones. All right, they could see it. And so this is basically an article talking about it, but you'll see that people were invited to come see these things all over back in 1906. He says, what archaeologists declare will solve the mystery surrounding the ancient mound builders was discovered recently in one of the series of hills along the Illinois River in that state. The find shows traces of handcraft of past ages and bones of those who wrought it. Several skeletons were exhumed, more than 8 feet long, also pieces of remarkable pottery, beads, and curious implements. Notice, they're just reporting that as fact. And there's an exposition that you could have seen in 1906. Here's another article, also in 1906. And they also talk about the same thing. Talks about the Jamestown Exposition, where people are going there and they're seeing these giant skeletons and they're seeing all this. People could see it back in the day. Today, if they found something like that, you wouldn't hear about it. Here's another one. This is another article. So anyone ever been to the Lovelock Cave in Nevada? Lovelock Cave in Nevada. So it's interesting that there's actually a story that there were giant skeletons found there, and it's a park now. And they'll talk about how there were people there, and they fought against the Paiutes, and they were cannibals, and they got all this stuff. Well, guess what? They also leave out the fact that the skeletons they found in Lovelock Cave were giants. But they're tending to find these giant human skeletal remains all over the place, and including here in Nevada as well. And so it talks about them finding a cave or another, another cache of giant human skeletons who are quite large. And I think in here they're over 7 feet tall. Now this is interesting. This was published in 1989. And what's interesting about it is that this is after evolution has come out. We all know that we evolved. We know millions of years. We know onward, upward progress. This man is an archaeologist, and he was tasked with digging up mounds in West Virginia. There's what is known as the Adena culture, which you can go to museums and you can see their pottery, their spearheads, their axe heads. But what you won't see is what he discovered there. Now again, this is in 1989. This is a peer-reviewed published book. It's out of print, but you can find it online and you can read it. You can read this book. That's how I found it. And maybe if you're a real sleuth, you maybe you'll find a paper copy or a hardback copy of it in a library somewhere. But it exists, is a real book, and this was serious archaeology. So I want you to see here, they dig up the mound and they document where all the bodies are. So they document, they find cache of pottery, weapons, spear points, all this stuff, and they talk about it. And I put a blue arrow over, I think it was figure 28, burial 54. So you see the B54, figure 28. Or is that 18? Is that 28? I think it's 28. Anyways, I just want you to keep that in mind. So here it is. These are the bones. This is burial 54. This is plate 21. There's burial 54. So this is the body here, okay? And this is what he says. This is what he says. He says this. He says this was extended. He talks about it going on here. He says he's buried in a bow-legged fashion. And then he says at the very last paragraph, this individual was of large proportions. When we measured the tomb, his length was approximately 7 foot 4 inches. So here they are admitting that they have found skeletons of unusual size back in the day. This is in 1989. Evolution was definitely on its way to dominating everything. Well, it had already dominated everything at this point. And even he has to admit, yeah, we did find a skeleton of unusual size. And here it is. You see the burial here, the mounds, and there's the skeleton. There's the body. They found it. And this is in West Virginia. And you can go there and there's a museum where you will not see this skeleton. They don't know what happened to it. If you go there, you go, what about that skeleton you found that was over 7 feet tall? What skeleton? We know we evolved. So we weren't very tall back then. And they will look you in the face and they will say that. You go, well, wait, what about this book here? Oh, they didn't know archaeology. I mean, they will say whatever because the myth that we evolved must be true. We cannot live without it because the consequences are dire. Here is a book. This is a scrapbook published in 1908 from the New York Rochester Historical Society, all right? And they talk about giants because there were so many being found. They said, okay, yeah, there's maybe some giants, but some of these heights of 10 feet, that's just too much. So what they do in trying to debunk the idea that anyone was ever larger than 9 feet tall, like Goliath, they actually show you giants in recent memory who were over 7 feet tall. So they go, okay, we can accept 7 feet, maybe 8 feet, but we can't accept 10. Which is funny because today we can't accept 7, 8 feet tall. We're like, no, we're bigger. And these are actual giants who existed. This one from Ireland, the other guys traveled with the P.T. Barnum Bailey Circus, and they were all large. And what's incredible is they weren't, like, except for the Chinese guy, they weren't frail. They were actually strong, very powerful men. And you can see more pictures of giant men here. Oh, each one of them over 7 feet tall. The one guy lifting his hand up is over 8 feet tall. And this is in 1908. And so think about it. In 1908, they're like, yes, we know we evolved, but there's no way there was ever a Goliath who was like over 9 feet tall. No way. Maybe 7, maybe 8 feet, but no way that tall. They were trying to undermine it while showing you that there were plenty of giants in the 1900s, which is crazy. But again, the evidence just keeps coming in these days. The evidence keeps coming. This was published in 1925. And listen to what it says here. It talks about skeletons found in Mexico. It says the Mexican government is planning to send a commission to Chihuahua Mountains to investigate the reported discovery of a number of perfectly preserved giant human skeletons measuring 12 feet. Again, this is not reported as fiction. This is reported as fact by serious people who were doing serious archaeology back then. Again, the idea is that, oh no way, nope, it existed. How many people have been here? Does anyone know where this is? This is White Sands, New Mexico. Yes, you've been there. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And it's crazy because this sand is very fine. It's like a beach in the middle of the desert. It's very different. They believe it was an ancient lake bed or whatever. Well, obviously, it was an ancient lake bed. There's a lot of evidence for that. But they're not sure how all that sand got in the middle of the desert like that because it's like beach sand. It's incredible. Very beautiful. But did you know that there's a White Sands National Park there where they actually have found human footprints which have been fossilized? Those are actual human footprints. And these are interesting because these are human footprints, but they're wearing like shoes. All right? And so they date these to like 10,000. They wrestle with the dates. Some of them are like 20,000. They don't know what to do. Because when they excavate the rock, see where they excavate the rock, they make that trench, they find human footprints. and rock that shouldn't be there. Like, how could human footprints be buried under all this rock? It doesn't make sense to them, but they have to believe in evolution. They just say, well, we're not sure. They find ancient footprints of animals and all that other stuff. And so you go, well, were there ever giant human footprints? If you were to go there and you were to ask, were there ever giant human footprints? They'll tell you, oh, no, never. They were all small. They didn't exist. But what you'll find here, this was published in 1981, October 1st, 1981, and they actually talk about finding human footprints here. Now, in this article is trying to talk away the evidence that there were giant human footprints. And so what they say is that there were prints that are roughly 24 inches long, which would be massive. That would make someone, if they had a foot that was over 24 inches long, they'd be roughly about 14 feet tall. But they say, well, there's no way this could have been human, so they say it could have been a camel, it could have been something else. And you go, well, when's the last time camels lived in New Mexico? Like, when's the last time? That seemingly just is impossible. But nonetheless, they're trying to talk this away. And so a gentleman writes into the paper who actually was there on the dig. And he says, no, you're wrong about that. He says that the average footprints were about 16 inches. Now, you're like, well, 16 inches, how tall are you? Roughly, if your foot is 16 inches long, you're about 9 feet tall. 9 feet tall. So that's what they found. And he talks about how they actually found that there and how they documented it. But the news cameras and the people doing all the reporting only wanted to talk about the camel footprints, the alleged dinosaur footprints. That's what they want to talk about. And he says, no, not only are these footprints long and tall, but we know that they were wearing moccasins. We can tell these were human footprints. And he writes it in because he was one who was there. And he says he has pictures and all this other stuff because he dug it up. But again, this is what you have to do. You have to suppress the facts when something doesn't fit the narrative of evolution. You just have to suppress it. This one is even more interesting. So how many of you have been to the Grand Canyon? And then within the Grand Canyon, you go to Havasupai Canyon. There's a canyon within a canyon. There's Havasupai Canyon. And it has petroglyphs all over it. And so this was discovered on this expedition with Samuel Hubbard, and he is a scientist and archaeologist, okay? And so he's going to talk about how they found petrified remains of human beings and how large they were. So let's see where it is. Let me see. Yeah, so this is what he says. So right says pictures show animals. So it says, wall pictures of animals found on the cliff near the human remains portray dinosaurs, mastodons, camels, ibex, deer, mountain sheep, three-toed horse, and other creatures, some still existing, some long since perished from the earth. The picture state Hubbards are small, arranging 9 or 10 inches high. They are very good workmanship, proving that the Mesozoic giants of southwestern America were by no means lacking in brains and culture. More than a score of footprints of human beings, as well as other animals, were also found in what has been a creek bed near the spot. The human footprints are between 19 and 20 inches. So again, these are human beings that would be between 9 and 11 feet tall. That's what they would be, 9 and 11 feet tall. And he says, and some of them show the marks of moccasins. The party which made these discoveries consisted of 4 well-known residents of San Francisco and Oakland. They were headed by Hubbard, who is a archaeologist and scientist, who bears the title of curator of the archaeology of Oakland Public Museum, who has also been who is also a capitalist, being a director of the Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company. So he not only is he an archaeologist, but he's also the founder of the Pacific Telegraph and Telephone Company. So he's very wealthy, but this is what he does in this part-time. With him were Judge Milton T. Farmer of Oakland, Judge J.W. Paulson of San Francisco, merchant, Frederick V. Shaw of the Oakland Museum. The fossils and the pictures were found in a little part of the Grand Canyon, many miles from the human habitations. And he says petrified giants. One of the petrified giants lies in the open air, and a cave once concealed him, having fallen away through the action of time. The other is concealed in a rock slide that has not been fully examined. Some of the wall paintings are too high up in the cliff that have not been closely observed. Others, however, are possible. One of the latter figures of the dinosaurs is about 8 inches high, plainly showing swan-like neck and downward curve of the hand of the giant reptile. Another shows the charging elephant and the trunk extended and the eye disproportionately huge, staring from one stone. The other show the ibex longhorns curving back the full length of the body, and the mountain sheep in the act of leaping, a dromedary or camel in the form of an unknown or to the modern era, deer, the prehistoric horse, goats, and so on and so on. And then he says these animals must have been contemporary with the artist who observed them, who chiseled them in stone. Now this is mistake number one. He looks at these petroglyphs and he says, okay, well, duh, the guys who were buried here probably observed these things and chiseled in the stone. But what is he saying? They chiseled a dinosaur in the stone, which means they would have observed a dinosaur. That's what he's saying. Now this is verboten. You can't have this. There's no way human beings ever existed with dinosaurs. Human beings can't be taller, they can't be smarter, they can't be better than they were today, and they certainly could have never seen dinosaurs. So you ask yourself, well, where are these findings? How come we've never heard about them? What happened to them? Well, here's pictures of them. This is an actual picture of the rock carving. And this is the San Francisco Examiner in 1925. And they're asking themselves, well, what do we do? What do we do? We believe in evolution, but we have something like this. Now, what's funny is if you go search for this online, it's going to be very hard for you to find. And when you do find it, if it comes up earlier in your search, it's going to be telling you that doesn't exist, it's not real, they didn't mean it, that's not what happened. And yet, here's the newspaper saying this very same thing. Here's the picture in full, which you see that they did here. And they're showing. They're like, look, the guy who discovered it said, I think it's a dinosaur. And everyone else looks at it, it looks like a dinosaur. And look, here are the ibex. Remember he talked about the ibex with the long horns that were not supposed to live on the America? And some other animals there too? And it looks like a human being standing behind them? And there's even dinosaur prints? You're not going to hear about that anymore because that's inconvenient. There's no way this could be true, because if it's true, then evolution has serious problems, and we can't have that today. We just can't have it. It doesn't fit our narrative. And so there's even modern articles written about it. And here's a modern article. And what they say here is that, yes, you may look at these petroglyph depictions here, and they may look like animals that were once extinct or had no business being on the continent where these animals were found, but it only looks like that. They didn't exist. That isn't real. It was ancient Native Americans and ancient Indians who were using euphoric drugs, and they were just making this stuff up. There's no way they could have seen any of these things, because if they did, evolution is not true. And this brings me to my point. We live in a society where it's thus saith the science. Thus saith the science. And because we believe in this as a society, it is easier to believe that there are aliens coming and visiting the earth that have reproduced with women and created a race of giants. It is easier to believe that there are angels that mated with women and created giants. It's easier to believe anything than the fact that mankind is falling apart and degenerating because we were made in the image of God. It's easier to believe that. As a matter of fact, it's so easier to believe, look at what they did. So remember this, and look what they did based on the evidence. This is supposed to be Adam. There's Goliath, and there's modern man. But I'm just kidding. But this is what they say, because they have found so many giants. They have found so many giants that even with their evolutionary idea, they have to say, well, okay, we had to have started like that, and we have found bones that make men like that, and this is what men are today. This is what they say, because they cannot accept the truth that we were started, and we didn't look anything like that, but we were started in God's image. That we were tall, that we were powerful, and we lived for quite long periods of time. Because the most disturbing part about all of this is that if we realize what our heritage was in God, then we realize just what sin has done to us. We realize just what sin, how it's destroyed us. If Caleb at 85 is able to fight giants, And we at 85 are just struggling to drive down US 19, which in and of itself is a task, let me be honest. Driving down US 19 is not for the faint at heart. But the point of the matter is that the human race has degenerated and degenerated and degenerated. And this is what the Bible teaches. And our only hope is to have our renewed image in Jesus Christ and the resurrection that He will give us. Well, He will make us into the image in which we were once first formed. But until we accept that, until this, we are going to continue to hear. We're going to continue to hear about this onward, upward progress, which is completely foreign to the Holy Scripture. And so I challenge you to this day. Are you going to accept thus saith the science? Or are you going to accept what God's Word says? If we are going downward, then it's time that we give our lives to Christ, because it's the only hope we have to receiving the heritage that He designed for us. Thank you.
Amen.